Back to part 2 on animating navigation using jQuery and CSS transitions. In part 1, I reviewed the HTML layout and CSS pseudocode, and in this video I'll add the necessary CSS to create our nav's transition state. Now, some of you might be new to HTML and CSS. I've decided to take the time to walk through adding the background image to the header, positioning it, as well as setting the CSS properties for the nav and all of the child elements. I'll make it a point also to discuss how adding properties like floats can affect the design, which then may require the use of overflow hidden or clear fix in order to get our design back on track. So let's start with adding and adjusting our header's background pick. As you can see, I've already taken the time to pick a background image and assigned it to the header using background. However, it still needs more work. First thing we're going to do is give the header a height, and we're going to give it, say, 400 pixels. So giving 400 pixels increases the size of the header. You see more of the pic, yet you don't quite clearly see the entire pic, and that's because the pic itself is an aspect ratio of 2900 by 1600. So we're only seeing the very top clear blue skies of the pic. In order to actually see the full pic, we're going to add background cover here as a property. I've added it. I'm just going to uncomment it. And now we actually see a beautiful pic of the Himalayan mountains. I really do like this pic. It is kind of awe-inspiring. I do, however, want it to align more with this design where the top mountain range is kind of pushed over to the left and raised just a bit. So I'm going to go in here and comment this back out, and we're going to accomplish that by adding a right and top position sizes to background. We're going to add a 60% for right, and for top we're going to add a 30%, and that should get us to more in line with the design that I was looking for. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so now let's move on to styling the navigation and its child elements and working through the rest of the pseudocode. So let's first make our nav element and UL kind of stand out by adding a background color. Now, I kind of like to do this during the initial designs as I can clearly see the elements position and how they are affected by, say, floats, padding, margins. So I'm going to give it a background color, and I'm going to use RGBA here. And I'm going to give it a red of 103, a green of 176, and a blue of, I don't know, say 209, and an opacity of 1, which really means no opacity. So we see the nav, and it takes over the full width. I'm going to take this same concept here and add it to the UL. So I'm just going to copy paste, make it easy. We'll add it to the UL. I am going to change the coloring to be, and the opacity, to be more of a black, and we'll give it an opacity of 0.4. And there we go. So I can see where the nav and the UL are positioned. So the next thing that I want to do is to position the UL. So I know the UL should be positioned on the right side. So we're going to do that by giving it a float property of right. So if we float it right, we see that it's been moved right, all the way to the right, flush with the right side. However, it's been removed from the document flow. So basically, the parent element, the nav, doesn't know that it has a child element. In order to get it back, we're going to use one of two methods. The first is setting overflow hidden on the parent element. So if we go here and we do this to the parent element, this should then recognize that it has child elements. That's the first approach. The second approach is using a clearfix class. Now, I've added the pseudocode up here, and this is where we're going to add it, reusable layout classes. And for this, I'm going to add a clearfix class, and I'm going to give it a pseudo class of after. Okay, and in here, we are going to define a display, a block. We'll give it content, It's not really going to have any content, but it needs to pretend it has content. And then we'll give it a clear both property. Okay, so now we still see it. We still see it floated over, and that's because I added the clearFix class to the nav before. Now, if I go ahead and I remove this, we should see that it's removed, and if I re-add it back, boom. So we know that clearFix does a trick, and clearFix is a more standard approach, so we're going to leave clearFix here for this particular solution. So let's move on to the LIs themselves, and let's position that. But actually, before we do that, let's give the H1 some properties, and for this, we are going to give it a font size of 30 pixels, and how about a color of white? Okay, now for some reason we're not seeing anything take effect, and sometimes in CodePen you need to precede it by its parent element. So by giving it, putting nav here, now it recognizes those properties. If we remove nav, and it goes back, it doesn't see font size, but it sees color. So it's kind of a strange anomaly, but whatever. We know how to fix it, and that's all that's important. What we do notice, however, is that because it's H1s are native block elements, it takes up the full width here. It's not sharing the space on either side of it, so it's pushing the UL down. We can fix that by changing the display to inline block, and that should allow us to share the space to the right. So now it moves the UL up. So that's great. So we have the UL up. So now let's deal with, let's move on to the LI. So for the LI, we're also going to float left. Okay, and that should reposition them left. That's great. I do see here in our pseudocode that we're going to add this hover state. We'll do that shortly. I first want to kind of get the UL, the LI, and the anchor tags just the right way. So let's move on to the anchor. And here in our pseudocode, we see we're going to add padding and font color and also bind it to our active class. So let's first start with adding the padding. So I'm going to go padding, and I'm going to give this, say, 20 pixels top and bottom and 30 pixels left and right. And let's see what happens. So if we add this, nothing takes effect. Well, once again, it's one of those needs to be preceded by its parent element. So there we go. Now I did it. What you can see is the left and right padding took place, but not the top and the bottom. And that's because it's a display of inline. That's its native display value. So we're going to change its display value to be inline block. And this will then change it so that it takes up the full width and height of this container. So we could keep doing this, 30 pixels, and it would still push it down. So this is actually going to kind of set the height of the nav. So we don't actually have to go into the nav and give it a defined height. The anchor tags are going to do that for us. So the next thing to do is what I see here is that the responsive, the H1, isn't necessarily kind of vertically centered. The anchor tags are, but the H1's not vertically centered. And we can accomplish that by giving it a line height of, I'm going to say 1.8 in this instance. That should work. We could have done it using padding top or margin top, but I like line height instead. The only other design option that I think we're going to need here is, if we take a look here, is padding left and right. So I see it's definitely pushed in left and right. So I'm going to go back in here and say, let's give this nav element padding. I'm going to give it 0 pixels top and bottom and 100 pixels left and right. And let's see if that takes effect. Actually, it doesn't. And once again, it is part of that. We need to precede this using that. So there we have. So that looks pretty good, right? I mean, that looks like the design that we're looking for. However, over here, I do see that the UL has a different color. right? So the UL over here versus the UL over here. The UL pretty much stands out here, but here we kind of removed the color for that. And that's because in the UL, we're giving it, once it's in that position, we're kind of actually removing all of the color and opacity. So I'm going to go in here and say, you know what? Now that we know where the position of it is, we're going to kind of remove all of the color so that we can kind of more align with our design. So if we do that, it's gone. And this is where the active class for the li anchor tag comes into play. See, for the anchor? So I'm going to go in here and do li and then do dot active, right? So for dot active, we're going to give it a background color. And that background color, well, let's take a look at what the background color is going to be for the active class. So I'm just going to copy and paste this just to, for simplicity's sake here. So let's go background color. And if we add background color of active, you can see now we're using black with an opacity of 0.2. We can clearly see that we're indicating to the user that home is the active one. The only other thing that I'd like to do right now is set the hover state. So I'm going to go li hover, and in this, let's just take a look at what we had for hover. Hover, I'm going to add two properties here. I'm going to, once again, just for simplicity's sake here, I'm going to copy and paste them. What I'm doing here is adding let's see, pointer. So it does look. So I have a double curly brace here. So for hover, I'm having a background color of black with an opacity of 2, similar to what the active is, and a cursor or pointer. So when we move our mouse over any part of the anchor tag, the mouse is changed, as well as the whole anchor, the whole li is, the background color is changed. So this really defines our initial state of this transition state, all the properties of our transition state. And it's going to conclude part 2. In part 3, we will move the appropriate CSS into their large and small classes, as well as define the large class CSS properties. And lastly, we will be adding the jQuery to monitor the scrolling and make the actual changes to the classes.